you had to describe the personality of Jesus, how would you do it? Is Jesus tender and mild all the way, or is he better described as raw, confrontational, and driven? Popular Christian devotional literature is going to give you the meek and mild picture. And yet, literary critic Harold Bloom described the Jesus of Mark as one of the most overpowering characters in the history of literature. Far from meek and mild, in Mark, Jesus has so much excess personality, he dominates everything around him. So who's got it right? Well, I think if we look carefully at Mark, we'll see that Bloom is simply showing us the Jesus there on the pages, not an overly sentimentalized projection from the 20th century. The sentimental view of Jesus depicts Jesus as serene, agreeable, receptive, and fully transparent. And I'm going to argue these are three errors that we can correct by reading the Gospel of Mark. On the other hand, Bloom describes Jesus as volatile, overflowing with energy, confrontational, authoritative, and a complete enigma to everyone around him. And we'll need to look at passages from Mark to actually see this. Well, first, let's consider the sentimental picture of Jesus. Christian artwork from the last 2 centuries tends to portray Jesus as soft-eyed, with flowing robes, almost feminine. Jesus is calm and predictable, he shows no emotion, and he comes off as otherworldly, if not completely detached. And yet, Harold Bloom sees the Jesus in Mark as emotionally intense. Far from being calm, Jesus consistently has a sense of urgency. And many good pastors will emphasize that in Mark, the Greek word euthos, or immediately, is used over and over again, I think over 40 times, to describe how Jesus is always rushing from place to place. Calm? No. Now, you might find Bloom's picture unsettling. Jesus with volatile emotions? That's not how we think of holy men. I mean, Buddha is always shown as completely calm. So there's a puzzle here. What is the relationship between spirituality and expressions of emotion? Why do we associate spirituality with detachment from the world rather than with wholehearted engagement with it? So far from serene, Bloom sees Jesus in Mark as passionate and potent. He's not all detached like an Eastern sage, but he's fully engaged in a dynamic and earthly ministry. Jesus overflows with an energy that can manifest powerfully in anger, compassion, and even anguish. So for example, there's a story where some religious leaders are waiting outside of the synagogue on the Sabbath. They're waiting to see if Jesus heals a guy with a withered hand, right? They're looking to try to catch him in something. And Jesus asks them, hey, look, is it lawful to do good or evil on the Sabbath? And they don't answer him. And Mark describes Jesus looking around in anger because of the hardness of their hearts. And it's not just the religious leaders. There's a point in Mark where Peter tries to pull Jesus aside from the other disciples and rebuke him. And Jesus makes it a point to, in front of the other disciples, to look at the disciples and rebuke Peter harshly. It's the harshest rebuke in the New Testament. He calls Peter Satan. I don't think that was a fond nickname. It was pretty harsh. Jesus is also described as being moved with compassion for the crowds, as in he was affected by them. Like he was moved with strong feeling. Perhaps most famous, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Mark describes Jesus as distressed and agitated. Jesus throws himself to the ground, saying he's deeply grieved. He's grieved unto death. I mean, he's sweating blood, okay? That's powerful emotion. Finally, and possibly even more famously, there is the cry of anguish on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? When we look at the words that Jesus uses in these moments, they effuse passion. They're unrefined, and Bloom describes them as raw. Moreover, they tend to be accompanied by decisive action. Jesus' emotions fit his dynamic pattern of activity. You might think of his kind of spontaneous cursing of the fig tree as an example. Bloom was not the first to notice how driven Jesus is, or see his incredible capacity for intense emotion. Jesus' energy in Mark, it stands out so clearly that Mark's gospel comes to be associated with the image of a lion. So Jesus is roaming around like a lion, securing his kingdom. And this is a theme that C.S. Lewis picks up with his character of Aslan, who's a Christ figure. All right, so agreeable or confrontational. The image of Jesus as serene goes hand in hand with Jesus as friendly or nice, high on the personality trait of agreeableness. He would certainly be non-judgmental. In the Ragamuffin Gospel, Jesus is described as the most non-judgmental person ever. The most non-judgmental person ever. Well, based on such a description, we'd expect to find Jesus to be the one who always listens first and speaks second. He'd carefully consider the advice and arguments of others, pause to consider the perspectives and points of others. He would respond to criticism in a measured way, and he'd generally seek to cooperate with others and find a middle ground. All right, well, let's look at Mark. And it doesn't take long to see that the scribes and Pharisees get an earful. Now, those pushing the non-judgmental picture try and account for this by saying, well, they were bad and so they deserved it. Or, well, Jesus was only harsh on religious leaders. This response pretty much assumes that Jesus was a 1960s hippie and his mission was to attack and invert the social order. So those on top are bad, those on bottom are good by default. That's a great 1960s story, but it's not the gospel. So the first problem is, if we're strictly talking about personality traits, Jesus' treatment of the scribes and Pharisees still counts as disagreeable and judgmental. Does Jesus listen to the scribes and Pharisees to hear them out? Does he ever attempt to learn from them? Does he try to find common ground or compromise? No. Well, that's disagreeable. And any therapist today, doing some conflict resolution between Jesus and the Pharisees, would say Jesus is guilty of black and white thinking, the cardinal sin of conflict resolution. But there's another problem. It's just not even correct that Jesus' disagreeableness is limited to the Pharisees. We see it directed at the crowds too, in the Olivet Discourse. In fact, we see it directed at his own family when they try to call him home because he sounds crazy. So think about that. Jesus sounded crazy, okay? Rather than accept the admonition of his family, he responds by basically demoting them to a step below his followers. Like, who's my mother and brothers? They're the ones who do my will. These are my mothers and brothers. That really shamed them in public. So they were probably really embarrassed and really upset by that. And then perhaps most significant of all, Jesus' harshest words of criticism in Mark are directed at his closest disciple, Peter, whom he calls Satan. We just talked about this. So hyperbolic? A metaphor? Sure. But if my kid gets into an argument with his friend at school and he calls him Satan, what's the school counselor going to say? I have a theory. Probably not that my kid is agreeable and the most non-judgmental kid ever. Finally, we should not forget, even though this gets talked about a lot, Jesus' mission culminates in a forceful occupation of the temple, overturning tables and driving the money changers out. Justified? Yes. But agreeable and nice, it was not. So look at the big picture. Jesus' general pattern is that he responds to criticism, not with understanding or any attempt to find a middle ground, but he responds with blistering criticism and judgment himself. Now, Jesus is always right, so that's okay. But most non-judgmental person ever? No, when it comes to Jesus' central message and mission, there's definitely a ton of confrontation and judgment. And really, this should make us think. There is a puzzle here. How is Jesus' incredible love compatible with judgment? How do those go together? Receptive or authoritative? How about receptivity? In a lot of devotional literature, Jesus is portrayed as if he is entirely receptive. Jesus has nothing to say to you, but is simply there to listen to you. It's taking this wonderful counselor description a little too far. So yes, you should of course cast your anxieties to God in prayer. But are we getting the ratio right? Is Jesus there primarily to respond and listen to you? Or are you supposed to mostly be listening and responding to Jesus? Well, at least during Jesus' earthly ministry, Jesus doesn't come off as very receptive. Jesus isn't waiting around to hear from people. Rather, he's going out and he expects them to listen. As already mentioned, you'll struggle to find in Mark Jesus really listening to anyone. Jesus is on an urgent mission, constantly moving from place to place. He's self-directed. Jesus doesn't adapt to what others are doing or look to what others are doing for guidance. Jesus is out in front, leading, and he's expecting everyone to fall in line behind him. Jesus doesn't go around pleasing people. Now, don't be confused here. Jesus goes around doing many good things for people. Healings, he preaches good news, pardons sins, performs exorcisms, and even feeds people. Jesus is always doing good things, but he's not doing so as a reaction or response to what other people are asking so much as carrying out his own mission. Jesus is also constantly disappointing people. He fails to conform to their expectations and to their desires. And again, bringing out the Pharisees as bad guys is a way of kind of obscuring how common this is throughout the Gospel of Mark. So yeah, they're the most famous example. But look carefully in Mark. Ordinary people, like the people in the synagogues, they were disappointed by his preaching. Surely they had anxieties, and they were looking for a comforting word from Jesus. But instead, he scandalizes them, preaching with authority. Again, Jesus' own family tries to stop him because he's not doing what they wanted him to do. Jesus leaves crowds before they're ready for him to depart, and sometimes entire towns want him to leave. Maybe it's helpful to just kind of sit back and say, like, look, how does Jesus talk to other people? How many 50-50 conversations does he have? Symmetrical conversations where Jesus is actively listening. No, he's constantly teaching. He's demanding people respond to him in a proper way. Jesus is challenging and testing everyone he talks to, even the people that he heals or delivers from unclean spirits. Jesus isn't conforming to other people's desires or requests. He's bringing his own agenda. He expects people to conform to it. Not just the Pharisees, but his family, crowds, and even his own disciples. Look in Mark and count how many times Jesus flat out commands people in an authoritative way. See how many times he challenges people, even people he's just healed, or his own disciples. Commanding, confronting, challenging, and teaching are the primary ways that Jesus interacts with others. And these are very authoritative ways of dealing with others. They're not very receptive at all. And I think the puzzle this leaves us with here is, in what ways did Jesus come to serve, and in what ways did Jesus come to rule? Transparent or enigma? When Jesus merely appears as a nice guy to talk about your problems with, he seems to be fully transparent. He's just the nice guy who listens. There are no hidden depths, no strong personality that might push back, no serious agenda or mission. But the picture we get in Mark is the opposite. Jesus is perhaps the strangest and most enigmatic character in literature, at least according to Bloom. So Jesus is running around. In Mark, he seems to literally be running around at times. What's he up to? Well, yes, he heals, he delivers people from unclean spirits. But it's never that simple. Jesus is never merely doing the good deeds. He's also looking for a certain kind of response. And you probably already know the answer. Faith. Jesus' ministry of healing and exorcism is surely out of love, but it should elicit faith. And this is the theme of some of his parables, such as the parable of the sower. All right, faith. But faith in what? Well, as Christians today, it's very easy to say, well, Jesus is the Son of God, second person of the Trinity. But Jesus doesn't go around preaching that in any direct way. In fact, when demons confess Jesus' identity, he typically tells them to be quiet. This theme in Mark is called the Messianic secret. Jesus will often test his own disciples regarding his identity. Who do you say that I am? And it seems the most fundamental theme behind all of Jesus' ministry of preaching, healing, exorcism, pardoning sin, is he is somehow revealing himself to the people, Pharisees and scribes, his disciples, and the crowds. But Jesus reveals himself in such a way that it requires an act of faith to see his true identity, which in Mark, it's rarely ever stated outright. So back when I was a teenager and interested in apologetics and defending Christian doctrines like the incarnation, it was always really frustrating how cryptic Jesus is in Mark, right? He's always speaking indirectly. He's always concealing himself, speaking in parables for the stated purpose of throwing people off the trail. I'm like, man, Jesus, you would make it a lot easier for me talking to my atheist friends if you would just say you're God. But now I look back and I realize that in Mark's gospel, he's creating this incredible dramatic tension, and he never fully resolves it, right? It's kind of like the end of the Sopranos, right? They're in the little diner and then the screen goes blank. It's like, what just happened? What just happened to Tony? Now, you can probably figure it out based on everything else that happens leading up to that. But I think Mark is doing something similar with Jesus. There's no nice and tidy resolution. You have to reflect on this remarkable career and recognize who Jesus is by faith. So the puzzle here is, what's Jesus up to? What's his mission? Why is there this sense of urgency? Who is this guy? Who is he really? All right, so those are the four misconceptions I think that you can correct by reading the Gospel of Mark. There's this idea that Jesus is calm and serene, that Jesus is agreeable and non-judgmental, that Jesus is a model of receptivity, and that he's just kind of this fully transparent, nice guy. No, I don't think so. Jesus was emotionally intense. Jesus was confrontational and judgmental. Jesus was authoritative, and Jesus was cryptic and enigmatic. Well, if you're interested in more topics and discussions like this, hit subscribe. See you next time.